Ariana is going to be recording, and we'll be sharing out the recording here later, along with the slides. We're going to have about 30 to 40 minutes in terms of the presentation, followed by some Q&A. But feel free to leave any questions you might have in chat throughout. And then, yeah, stay till the end. We usually have some freebies or things that we will share sort of as a wrap up. And so here's the topics that we're going to cover today. The first one is we're going to just look at some trends, right? Just to make sure we're all on the same page here. And then we're going to talk about the connection between donors and volunteers. We're going to share a couple best practices or things that we've seen that are interesting in terms of how potentially engage your constituents or your volunteers as donors. And then, of course, as a technology company, we have to talk about some technology that may be helpful. And then we'll wrap things up at the very end. Cool. And if you are joining us, if you see things in chat, people were just sharing their favorite ice cream flavor along with their name and their organization. So that's if you're just joining us now. All right. And so in terms of trends, so this is a relatively new report that came out by the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. This is it in Q4 of 2023 is when they put this out. So year over year, you know, the message, I think, no surprise, right? So we saw a decline in both donors, dollars, and retention, 3.4% in terms of decrease in donors, in terms of dollars, 2.8%. And then retention rates were down 2.5%, right? So certainly not the trend lines we want to see. And unfortunately, you know, this was actually true across all different sizes of donors, right? So whether you're talking about micro, small, mid-size, major, or super size. And perhaps even more concerning is the fact that if you really look at the change really came from your higher end donors, right? That drop really was more substantial here, you know, 6.8, 7%, double the change for your small donors, right, in terms of percentage drop. And then not to beat on sort of the negative news drum here too much, but this was also true across you know, all frequencies of donations as well, right? So you saw 3.8% decrease for just one-time donations or donors, people that donated twice or three times. And again, you're seeing that really the drop is coming primarily from your recurring or donors, right? And so, which is probably even more concerning given that the vast majority, you know, a big chunk of your donations year over year are actually coming from this bucket, right? And so, and this is not a new trend necessarily, right? We've seen this decrease for the last few years. And so 6.3% decrease in 21, 10.7 decrease in 22. There was that sort of momentary increase we had during 2020 during sort of the peak of COVID, right? So lots of folks were sort of leaning in and giving, but that has quickly reversed course. And at least, you know, I guess silver lining, the decrease was lower than the prior year, right? And it says minus 4.9. They've actually adjusted that to 3.5% or so because of just like the way they collect data for this project, right? So all of that's real bummer news, and that's why this is important, right? We all know that this trend of individual donors is on a decline. On the flip side, and this is much better news, this is our data from Civic Champs. We actually see a growth in volunteerism across the board in 2023, right? And so whether that you're looking at this first column, active volunteers per org, we saw a 1% increase with our internal data. Hours per, you know, volunteered per organization was up 6% overall. Monetary impact was up. And then activities, or the number of times people volunteered, was up even more at 8%, right? So that's kind of, you know, unlike on the donation side, volunteering based on our data has really actually continued to grow. And that's not just our data, right? If you look at, you could do this yourself. If you go to Google Trends today, or yeah, actually this, I updated this chart today, this morning, and you could see that people searching for volunteering opportunities near me is at an, you know, more or less a, you know, all-time high here in the last 5 years. And so on the left, you have 2019, right? There, this is let's say 50, right? So 50 searches or so per I think this is per day perhaps, or per some duration. And then you have COVID-19, the impact, right? People really weren't searching, right? People were stuck at home. And then that came back up and sort of recovered pretty quickly, right? By 2021 here. But if you look all the way to the right of the graph, which is today, right, we've actually hit peaks here at 100, which is double what we had in 2019, right? And even if you look a little bit earlier, right, even in 2022 or 2023, the peaks were really around 75, right? And so we've continued to really grow that interest, which is fantastic. And so there's lots of interest out there. Volunteer Match also shows very similar data. They made the most number of connections in the last 4 years with 735,000 connections, or a 23% increase year over year from their platform. And then if you looked at additionally, this is a very, very new report by Toby Johnson and the Volunteer Management Progress Report that she puts out every year. And so you could see in 2024, the number of active volunteers has really grown, right? And so, let me go back here. And so this is fall 2020, 21, 22, 23. And so, the easiest way to read this is just look at the colors, right? And so you could see the trends pretty quickly that way. So on the left is, if you had no volunteers, 1 to 25 volunteers, right, in the sort of 29.6% in fall of 2020. That's dropped down to 7% here in fall of 23. And you can see where the bands got skinnier. We're quite skinny here at the top end, right, with 1,000 or 750 plus volunteers, right? Those buckets have really grown here over time, right? And so the number of volunteers per organization from this report also shows a very similar trend. And then her report also shows the same thing in terms of number of hours being reported, right? So on the left is sort of your low number of hours per average hours per volunteer, so 0 to 10, right? As you see that bar shrink, you'd really see the right side grow here, right? And so, as an example, 15.5% of folks reported they did 90 to 100 hours per month in 2024 here, versus only a little under 10% in 23. Right? So really seeing a nice increase both in the number of volunteers and the number of hours, increasing our capacity, which is fantastic. Yeah, and then you'll see Ariana is linking the report here in chat in case folks want to read and dive in more. And of course, further confirmed by you all. So thanks. We started adding some registration questions, to our most recent webinars. And so one of them, as you remember, we asked if you all had an increase or not. And so 55% of you all said you have more volunteers now than you had before, or versus last year. 29% said, you have about the same, and only 16% have fewer volunteers, right? And so the vast majority, right? So 55 versus 16, we're seeing quite a nice growth. And so combining those two things, right, is really the premise for this webinar, which is as you're seeing this decline in individual giving, you are seeing this increase in volunteerism. And so how do you potentially leverage that trend to offset that, the decline in donations, right? And so the first thing you have to believe is that there is a connection between volunteers and donors. I think a lot of us here on the call know this intuitively, but let's look at some of the data and what that says, right? And so this is from Fidelity Charitable. This is a couple years old, but I'm not sure this has changed significantly. But basically on this chart, what you're looking at is, from left to right, they have folks that only volunteered at all the organizations they supported financially. So there's a huge, 100% overlap. They had respondents say, hey, I volunteered, significant overlap in sort of my volunteerism work and the places I donated. And then there's some overlap between where I volunteered and where I donated. And then there is no overlap, right? And so you can see there's an 87% overlap of where people donate and where they volunteer, right? And then if you look at just what motivates people to volunteer, the number one reasons people give are that, one, I like to contribute about a cause I care about, or I make a difference in my community. And sort of number three is about connecting with others, right? So they wanna make a difference in the work that they do, in terms of helping out their community and a cause that they care about. And then on the flip side, if you look at why donors keep giving, this is from Bloomerang. These are kind of 7 reasons that they list. Whether that is perceiving the organization to be effective, they think that they know what to expect from each interaction. They receive timely thank yous. They receive opportunities to make their views known. They feel like they're part of an important cause. They feel that their involvement appreciate, or they receive info showing who is being helped, right? So these are all the reasons why donors keep giving. And you put those two lists side by side, right, of why donate and why volunteer, actually there's a really strong overlap between the two, right? In terms of the top 2 reasons people volunteer is because they want to contribute to a cause they care about or make a difference in their community, which is very similar to, they feel like they're part of an important cause, or they feel like their involvement is appreciated, right? And of course, receiving info showing who is being helped. If you're doing the volunteering, you're obviously seeing that in person. Right? And then finally, another pretty recent publication that we looked up for you all was, Giving Pulse just released a report, and part of that report actually talked about this very specific interaction between volunteers and donors. And what they found is that volunteering has a greater influence on giving than giving on volunteering, right? So volunteering also retains donors, whereas donating has a much lesser effect at creating and retaining volunteers. So that's super interesting, right? So basically, if you're able to grow your volunteer core, or the number of volunteers you have, you will naturally, without really doing much different, right, increase the amount of donations you get, just simply because volunteering influences people to donate naturally, right? The other thing that I thought is the second part of this quote, where retaining donors, right? And so the idea here is, like, if you can get your donors to volunteer, it will actually help retain them as donors as well, offsetting that 7% decrease year over year that we just reviewed earlier. And then this chart is very technical, so we won't go into too much. But the other really interesting thing that Giving Pulse talked about is when you looked at times when donations go down, right? They use what they call the Jacquard score. But basically what the graph is showing is, in moments when donations are down, it is your volunteers that are that remain as donors, right? They maintain giving behavior and are sort of continuing to support the cause, even as other donors no longer contribute, right? And so, as at this very top, so you see this little peak here. That is the moment when donations were the lowest overall, but that's also where this quote unquote Jacquard score is the highest, which is you could see people that gave both, right, is kind of making up a big chunk. I think they said roughly half of donations at that time came from people that volunteer, right? And so when you're doing really well, right, you're getting lots of donations, your volunteers, contribute on a percentage basis a little bit lower because you have lots of other donations. But when everyone leaves, right, your volunteers are the ones that stay. And again, if folks have questions, feel free to put those in chat, and I'll try to keep my eye on it as well. Right. All right. And then, come back to Fidelity Charitable, they also show in their report that when they ask, the influence of volunteering on financial support, 50% of folks say they give more, only 5% say they give less, and 45% say they give roughly the same. But basically, half of your folks that volunteer will actually contribute more, or they feel, they're going to be more motivated to contribute more. I know that's counterintuitive to some folks, right? In terms of thinking like, well, if someone gives their time, maybe they're less likely to give their dollars. But in actuality, that's the flip side, right? And again, if you're able to grow your volunteer core, you're going to grow your donor base as well. This is the same data, except a little bit of a different date. And what it did was it split the impact of volunteerism across generations, right? And so the data is a little different. And so we actually see a higher percentage, right, in the last page, a newer report by Fidelity. But I think the thing that I found most interesting is that millennials, relative to Gen Z, relative to baby boomers, really, really appreciate volunteerism, and they're more likely to give more if they volunteered, right? And so as millennials, and hopefully I'll do a new bar here on the left, which is your Gen Z folks here. But what we want to do is make sure as we're building our donor pipeline that we're cultivating some of these younger generations as well. And if volunteerism is the thing that really motivates them, then you want to lean even more in that direction. Right. And so as a little bit of a recap, right, and this is kind of heavy on text, so we won't read all of it. But basically, right, so one, volunteers or donors are not distinctly different groups, right? They're the same. They're as an individual, that also intuitively makes sense, right? Like people don't think of themselves as like Gung the donor, Gung the volunteer, I am me. And so my affinity towards your organization is sort of is impacted by my actions as a volunteer or as a donor, right? And vice versa. And of course, this is a way to provide a new donation stream, right? This is why you should activate your volunteers as donors. That's kind of the no duh. But then, based on even some of the data we saw, it deepens the engagement of the volunteer and the donor, right? So if you get your volunteers to donate or your donors to volunteer, you're actually deepening that engagement. They're going to receive, for better or worse, different communications from us as nonprofits, just because we, unfortunately, probably treat our donors and volunteers differently, and so that's another reason potentially to engage them as donors. All right, and so with all of that, we see some pretty great statistics that back up this idea that growing our volunteerism is not only a viable solution because there's a lot more interest today, but also the fact that volunteers are naturally inclined to become donors. And as we're trying to offset our individual giving, this could be really a new way to drive that pipeline. Right? And so how might we go about engaging these folks? Right. And so first, we're going to share a little bit more information in terms of trends or stats, just to level set, and then we'll talk about very specific actions that you might do. Right? And so here, what we're looking at is Volunteer Match put out a report as well recently that talks about why, where do people decide where to volunteer? So we looked at earlier sort of this is the same report that talked about the why, right? They want to volunteer because it's to help their community. It's a mission they care about. But then they have to pick, right? Where am I going to do it? And these are the factors that influence that decision. And so the first one, of course, is unsurprisingly, they feel strongly about the mission of the organization. Second is they enjoy the specific task. And the third, it actually is it fits in their schedule. And so my challenge, right, and maybe it's food for thought for folks, is really the first one, the main thing, you're not going to change. There's a, your mission is your mission for the most part. You're not, for the most, you're not really going to change that. But are there ways to think about broadening the tasks that people can do? Are there ways to make your schedule more flexible? If those are the things that really impact where they decide to volunteer, right? Just kind of food for thought. And the second thing is, what do they want to do? And so this is a list of options that Volunteer Match provided to respondents. And so advocacy, professional trade skills, general physical labor, right? Business skills, creative skills, caring people skills. And so the number, 77% of volunteers that responded said they want to use their caring or people skills as part of their volunteerism. And so as you're designing your programs, and your opportunities, it's important to think about, how could you allow people to showcase their caring or people skills? And then when you're recruiting, right, how do you make it clear that there's an opportunity to do so? Right? That's the thing that really people want to see a lot of, right? The other thing that, kind of food for thought is during COVID, you saw this clear trend, right, towards informal volunteering, in part because a lot of nonprofits, couldn't do the formal volunteering anymore, and people just really wanted to give back. But it's really heightened this awareness that you could actually do mutual aid groups, do more informal volunteering, and not through an organization. And some schools, I think, right, for a National Honor Society or otherwise, started to allow that kind of volunteerism, just because the other formal version wasn't available. And so again, right, thinking about as you're designing your programs, are there ways that it can feel like people are having more direct impact, right, of helping their neighbors, even if it is through the organization, right? And then yeah, so what I'll go into next is just thinking about a couple different ideas for folks that might be interesting to adopt and as you're trying to activate your volunteers to become donors. And so one interesting idea is thinking about volunteer pledges. And so a lot of times organizations have pledges for donations, especially schools, right? They say, hey, would you pledge $25 as a gift? People make the pledge and then they sort of finalize the contribution down the road. But you rarely see an ask to pledge for hours, right? And so if certain volunteers are happy, maybe their first time volunteer, you can ask them to say, hey, not only can you come back, but we really want people to come back regularly. Would you be willing to pledge that, you'd be willing to come once a month or once a quarter, right? Whatever it makes the most sense for your organization. And the benefit of that is that you can remind them of their pledge, of course, right? Just like the financial pledge, and say, hey, you made this pledge. We'd love to have you back next month. Here's the opportunities. The second part, of course, is if for some reason people get busy, this is also a great avenue to ask for financial contribution as well, right? So you could say, Alicia, we'd really love to have you back. It's been a couple months since we've seen you, but we understand, life gets busy. We really value your, volunteer time with us. And, for us, your contribution of 8 hours last month or whatever was worth X dollars, $240, right? That we otherwise would have needed to hire somebody else for. If you can't make it, would you consider, supporting another volunteer to volunteer with us, right? So for us, or to a financial contribution to offset, right, the volunteer hours, right? So that's one idea here to think about. Another one, and this is kind of two ideas kind of packaged in one here, is matching gifts or grants. And so another easy way to activate your volunteers as donors is really not even having them donate, but their companies might have actually matching programs. And so these often are financial matches, right? So they'll match $1 for $1, right? And you can let folks know that's available. But also many of them have volunteer grants. And so, for example, Starbucks, for any Starbucks employees, will match $5 per hour. And I think it starts at even just 1 hour, right? And so it's like an easy way for people to feel like they're financially contributing, and for you to get dollars, right? Just like, hey, I noticed that you mentioned your employer is Starbucks. Did you know that they have this matching program? Here's where you would submit your request to have that match for us. Thanks so much, right? And then the bottom one is really, in terms of non-corporate matching. Many of us have seen this or done this before, which is a foundation and or a large donor might give a larger gift and say, hey, this is a matching gift to really activate more donors, right? To see, if you can match $1 per, I'll match $1 per $1 for everyone that donates up to X amount, right? A couple tips there, if you do that model, is one, you may not share with folks, how much the match is, right? Just because people will just sort of match up to just hit the match. But the other thing we've heard from some of our friends in the space is that you can do this on after each volunteering session, right? And say, hey, Jennifer, we really appreciate your gift of time here. You've also now unlocked a matching gift. Bob, just making this up, right, has said he's going to willing over the next 72 hours match $20 for any donations that our volunteers give, right? And just the benefit of that is having a time-sensitive ask that says, it's specific to you as a volunteer and your ability to donate, and you could explain a little bit more on why that's important. But they have this ability, and it feels kind of nice and special to say, oh, well, I'm contributing $40, but it's getting matched, dollar for dollar, or $20 is getting matched to that from somebody else, right? And so that's another idea that we've seen successfully implemented. I think Feed My Starving Children is the example that I'm thinking of, and they work with the organization called Kindly to make that happen. And so that's something that we've seen in the space. And then last but not least, here is a template. I'm not going to go over all the details here necessarily, but as you finish your volunteering session, right, if you wanted to do more of an email-like campaign, what would that email potentially look like, right? And so we just created a little template for you all in case it's helpful. Again, I'm going to share this presentation both in video, recorded, but also the slides, so you'll have this. But basically, we find that a pretty simple 3-part format works pretty well, which is first, you thank them for their time and highlight their personal contribution, right? So in this case, it's hi Sarah, thank you for your 5-hour support to, provided that knocked lupus out of the park. It made it possible to raise, $1,200 for lupus research, and then tell them what still needs to be done. The more data we collect, our fundraising goal is $150,000, and that covers the cost for licensing devices, right? That makes this possible. And then explain why donating and volunteering are helpful, right? And you should make it clear that you want them to do both, right? And so, language like, it's because you give your time that we're able to spread the message and reach others willing to donate to the cause, right? Something that really ties in the two things together. Okay? So hopefully that's helpful in terms of some of the tips. If other folks have other tips that you've seen, well, feel free to put those in chat, and maybe we can share those as well with everyone. Okay. Of course, we're a technology company, so I would be remiss not to highlight how technology could support this effort. And so when we think about volunteerism, there's this, volunteer management life cycle that we talk about. And so you go from recruiting to onboarding to scheduling, engaging, retaining, and reporting. And so Civic Champs, right, we support this whole cycle ourselves. But what you're really talking about today is really around kind of engagement and retention, right? And so as you have a volunteer that's been engaged, how do you continue to engage them? How do you retain them both as a volunteer, but now activating or retaining them as a donor as well, right? And so the way we might think about this is, we allow folks, for example, on our mobile app to check in and out really simply. They could select what they're here for, right? And it kind of checks them in. So, we have a kiosk that does largely the same thing as well. And so it has a little timer. And then at the end, though, more uniquely to us, is we also collect feedback, whether that's on a kiosk or on the mobile app. We're able to collect feedback from your volunteers. Super, super useful from a retention standpoint, both in terms of people that are sad, right, and or unhappy, and you want to reach out to them to figure out what's going on. But also, if they are happy and they were super satisfied, right, these are the people that you have a higher propensity to come back again, right? And so you can actually target folks like that and say, hey, we'd love to have you back, or bring a friend, or whatever it is. But also from a donation standpoint, this allows you to not solicit the folks here on the left, right? But really only target the folks that had a better experience. Right? And of course, we provide all of that on reporting, right? And so you could see the smiley faces, you can export this data, you could see any reflections that they might have shared. Some of the reflections are really nice too, as a way to capture, testimonials, or even like fun little quotes to share with the team, right? If someone had a really good time, what a positive thing you can share with the rest of your team to say, hey, did you know like XYZ volunteer left this really kind note about us and our mission, and could be kind of a nice pick-me-up for everyone. And then the next part, right, is we've actually spent the last couple of years integrating and working on integrations with various donor management platforms. And so the benefit, of course, is we have limited capacity to build software. And so there's much better software in terms of managing your donors. And so, for example, we have real-time integrations with Little Green Light or Blackbaud, Razor's Edge, and XT. And then we have some monthly syncs like Donor Perfect and Salesforce, and plus more to come, so to speak, right? But the nice thing here is if you have all your volunteer data in your donor database, then you're able to do things like pull a report that shows, volunteers who have contributed 20 hours or more, but haven't donated this year, right? Or, show me all my happy volunteers who haven't donated this year. Or you can, look at a specific event even, right? So the, knock lupus out of the park event, who's everyone that went there, and maybe we can customize messaging in a campaign as well, right? DonorBox, that's a great question. I was just talking to them. I asked them a question. I don't know if they actually allow tracking of volunteer hours. That was the question I just sent back to their team today. So we're working on it, I guess, is the short answer. I know they just launched their CRM, so I don't know if they support volunteer hours yet, but if they do, yeah, we would love to work with them. You should ask them if they integrate with us, and that'll give them a little nudge as well. So great question, Melissa. And then, yeah, so that's, I didn't want to keep this overly long, right? Kind of make it short and pithy if I can. But hopefully, the data, the trends, all of that made sense. Perhaps gives you some ammunition, if you will, to go back to your organization to share your ideas and say, hey, here's why it makes sense for us to run this new campaign. Here's why it makes sense for us to really spend more resources to recruit more volunteers, because they're a natural pipeline to donations, even if we don't do anything special, right? I think that's the key, is like, you don't have to do anything special. If you double the size of your volunteer core, and you at some point ask them for a donation, you're going to get more donors, right? Like that's just like very, very simple, right? And then, is there any data about plan giving in association with volunteering? I don't have data about plan giving. This is legacy gifts, potentially. I've heard anecdotally some very impactful stories, right, of a volunteer who, over years, contributed, volunteered again and again, and then finally gave like a legacy gift. But I don't have the data for that. So beyond sort of the stories that perhaps some of you have also heard, that's all I can go off of. And then finally, as a wrap up, stay in touch, right? This is my contact info, email, phone, and LinkedIn as well. Please reach out on LinkedIn. I love staying in contact with you all. And then we also have a feedback form. If you liked this presentation, please let me know. If you hated it, also please let me know so we don't have to do it again. And then if there's any ideas you have, yeah, we really appreciate. So we've been collecting this for every webinar we do, just so we know what you all appreciate or don't like. So yeah, please provide feedback. And then, yeah, any other questions, feel free to come off mute. I saw there's a question here from Elizabeth about pricing. So for pricing, you can just go on our website. It's thechamps.com/pricing. And so we list our pricing. It's priced by sort of number of active volunteers you have over the course of the year. So you could take a look at that. Right? And you can, of course, yeah, Ariana shared, scheduling demos with us. And then Jennifer had a question. We don't have a volunteer program, but our officers are volunteers. We'd also like to engage more board members as committee members. How could this be adapted to them? I think, yeah, I'm not sure I have a sort of like transformational answer there, other than you should ask them to be committee members. I think always, sharing the impact of the work that they would have as a committee member. My experience actually on boards is that if you're not part of a committee, the board meetings can be actually quite dry and boring, and so that I think could be a very compelling reason to be part of a committee, to be actually more involved and feel like they're having a more direct impact, right? That's why they're volunteering as a board member. That's why they're donating. And so my sense is, if you had good committees and they're feeling like they're really contributing, your donation dollars from those board members will also be higher over time, Jennifer. So that's, I think, the tie-in or corollary. And then, yes, we will send you a copy of the presentation to everyone that's registered, along with a recording of the presentation as well. And I think that's all the questions we had here. And so the last thing I have is, we do have 2 very cool webinars coming up. We're gonna have 2 guests. The next one's gonna be on August 1st. Allison Fine is gonna be joining us. She is the CEO of Every.org. They're a fundraising platform that's free to use, and then helps people identify and find organizations they want to support. And we're really going to talk about relationship building technology solutions for nonprofits, right? And so technology can be used in many ways. She actually just did a test recently about tipping, right? So like, supporting Every.org in the form of a tip, and how they've been able, as a nonprofit, to leverage that. But you can imagine a very similar models or concept could be adapted to your nonprofits as well. So we're gonna have a conversation with Allison. That one's gonna be less of a presentation and more of a conversation between Allison and I. We'll ask your questions. When you register, we'll put in we'll share the registration link soon. We'll have an opportunity for people to pose questions to Allison in advance, so she has some time to prep. And then on the 15th of August, we're going to be joined by Sarah King. This is going to be a very unique presentation in that she's a former volunteer manager and now focuses on sort of supporting leaders, supporting frontline staff with managing, your own stress, your own psyche, your burnout. And so this session is recovery strategies for volunteer managers. Sarah just presented at Points of Light as well, and this is kind of more of a hopefully a treat for you all to find some strategies to make sure that you're all feeling good every day, waking up, going to your job, so that you can continue to bring impact to your communities, right? And so burnout, I know, is a big issue for folks in our sector, and so Sarah's going to really share her expertise on how you might be able to manage that. So I'm excited for that as well. I've always enjoyed sort of mindfulness presentations and whatnot. And that's it. Thanks everyone for joining today. We'll give you back 15 minutes of your time. We try to keep this as short as we can. And so, yeah, we'll be in touch hopefully and see you guys here in a couple weeks.